So I wanted to, before we got to food, just take a moment to remind everyone of why we're wearing poppies over our heart today and tomorrow, because these, of course, are the classic symbol of remembrance of Armistice Day. And Kirby put this poem up. This was a poem in Flanders Field that was written by John McCrae, a Canadian, in 1915 after having watched so many of his comrades die and then having taken care of so many, many more. And the poem was sort of, if they had the term in 1915, it went viral. This poem went viral around the world as a really heartbreaking expression of what people in the trenches were experiencing. An American woman, a teacher, Moyna Mitchell, read in Flanders Field, and she worked with the YMCA, and was often trying to help returning soldiers. And she read the poem, she wrote her own little verse in response, and she was working at this time in a New York office of the YMCA, and she went out and went to department stores all over New York trying to find silk poppies that she would then give to people who came in to the YMCA. Sorry, I keep getting that confused. And so she then started a campaign to have widows, children, and then later disabled veterans make these poppies and then sell them for just a few cents to help support veterans' causes and to help support their families. And so since 1919, we have worn poppies in remembrance of those who fell during World War I. So I just wanted to thank the Society for making the poppy buttons. Make sure you get one if you haven't already on your way out, and make sure you wear it tomorrow on Armistice Day. Okay, so let me get it. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is, can the Kaiser, the politics of food during World War I? As you all well know, this is an audience who doesn't really need to hear this, but on April 15th, when Jeannette Rankin went to take her first time on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, and she famously said, "I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war." And as Rich said, she was not alone. Many other members of Congress, including senators and representatives, joined her. Well, you know, the war sort of diverted Jeannette Rankin's agenda. She had wanted to bring suffrage to a national stage. And when she cast her vote against the war, but then when the majority ruled, she went along with the majority decision, and she turned her attention to helping to sell Liberty bonds, to hosting Montana troops when they came through war on their way to Europe, and working for the Red Cross. And it turns out that while she had had her heart set on giving her first speech on the floor of Congress about suffrage, her first speech was actually about food. And the first agency, other than the draft, that the United States government created to help prosecute World War I was the U.S. Food Administration. And part of the Food Administration would be to, in fact, involve women on the domestic home front in many, many ways. Rankin, in her speech, was specifically calling upon the government to hire women as workers in what was supposed to be the first part of the food campaign, and that was carrying out a survey of the food supply in the United States. I have not been able to find any record that women were actually hired to do this, but it kind of speaks to one of Rankin's agendas during her short time in the Congress, and that was to improve the conditions of women workers and to find more work for women. She argued that food conservation as a natural problem, as a national problem, is a natural outgrowth of women's fundamental work. So during the course of the war, the meaning of women's work would undergo quite a significant change. Connections, you know, Rich talked about all these various dichotomies that we had to deal with in World War I, and the connection between women's place in the home, between domesticity, and between public politics really gets redefined in the war, and I want to come back to that at the end of this. But women would be called upon to turn their daily chores of housekeeping, especially of providing food, of caring for their families, literally into weapons of war in the service of the troops and of the Allies. So women were asked to think about food in political ways. And just as Rich talked about, there were unintended consequences, women took thinking about food in political ways into areas that the government had not intended or imagined. So the final version of the Lever Bill, which created the U.S. Food Administration, launched a huge bureaucracy headed by Herbert Hoover. Hoover, of course, will go on to become president of the United States, but during the war, at the time the United States gets into the war, he's already famous as a leader of the Belgian Relief Fund. Belgium, of course, had been decimated by the Germans in the early years of the war. And Hoover was, by this point, a very wealthy man. He'd been a mining engineer. He had great experience in organizing very complicated logistics, and he offered his services to the government, and he served as a volunteer in his tenure as head of the Food Administration. So food was a critical issue from the beginning of the war, and by 1917, when the U.S. gets into the war, it is, in fact, very critical in Europe because there were places that projected that they only had a few weeks left of food. As you have heard, the rich farmlands of France were now fixed battlefronts. They were the sites of these hundreds and thousands of miles of trenches. The men in those trenches were the farmers who had worked those lands. So you don't have the land to grow the food, you don't have the farmers to grow the food. And the women who were taking up the plow were not, there just was not enough labor and enough land. So the U.S., of course, had been making a lot of money shipping food to the Allies, and they're poised to make more once the country enters the conflict. So when the Food Administration adopted the slogan, "Food will win the war," they meant that literally. All those old adages about an army moves on its stomach, you can't wage this war without food. And this is one of the most famous of those posters, and Maggie has a lot of these wonderful posters in the exhibit. You're going to see them again here. This particular poster was translated into lots of different languages. It's Yiddish up here, so making a direct appeal to immigrants to do their part. And Hoover develops a kind of three-pronged food campaign, to use a military metaphor, and each front had a place for women. So the first sought to increase production, the second to preserve food, and the third to conserve food by reducing domestic consumption. So I want to talk about each of these three. And then in order to sort of marshal this campaign, each state had a food administrator appointed, and then each county, under the purview of the Council of Defense, had a county food administrator, although some counties never bothered to, Montana counties never bothered to appoint one, and some, while I'll tell you some stories of the more vigilant, some were very lackadaisical about it, so it was kind of erratic. But the food administrator from Montana was Alfred Atkinson. He was a professor of agronomy at what was then called Montana State College in Bozeman. This is the agriculture building and what campus looked like during that period of time. Atkinson will become president of the university in 1919, so he gets a lot of administrative experience during the war. So it's farmers and ranchers who tackled that first charge to increase production. And I'm not going to go into this because Rich covered a lot of this, the seed loans, easy credit, and then a guaranteed price of $2.20 a bushel for wheat. So what that meant is acreage under cultivation in Montana doubles during the war. And there's also a lot of incentives to increase livestock production as well. So you've got men leaving for war, you've got acreage under cultivation greatly increasing. Who's going to do that work? The problem of a labor shortage was discussed within the Extension Service and within lots of officials. Alfred Atkinson did not originally take women seriously as a useful labor force in agriculture. And Atkinson, this is one of my favorite quotes from the history of Montana State College. One of his colleagues described Atkinson as a man who might be wrong, but was never in doubt. So in 1914, he delivered an address called Agriculture for Women, in which he pronounced, if Mr. Jones was a farmer, Mrs. Jones was a necessary adjunct, not to farming, but to Mr. Jones. So women's place was in helping their husbands. In June of 1918, an Extension Service bulletin, also published in Bozeman, speculated on, well, who would, in fact, work the harvest? And the author suggested that if the transient harvest crews, which were, very common, were not plentiful enough, help might be engaged from the United States Boys Working Reserve. And this was a cadre of high school boys, usually from cities, who were given training to do agricultural work. And then he said, if there's not enough of them, or if we can't get them in Montana, maybe we could get retired farmers who, he said, quote, with a little hardening up, could manage the physical demands. And then he said, women had, in fact, been mentioned for farm work, but he said, most of us do not like the idea of asking women to do the work of this character. And even having recognized, or he reluctantly recognized that, in fact, people would be seeing women in the fields more often that summer. So this prospect, while he recognized it reluctantly, it still really kind of ate at him, and he goes on in this bulletin to say that he really first preferred the idea that urban men would return to the farms. He said, urban men do jobs that women could easily do. So send women to the cities, send men back to the farm, because after all, public opinion should be such as to force every man to do a man's job. So again, this kind of peer pressure that we've heard about from so many of our speakers. But at the same time, the government was encouraging every man, woman, and child to plant a garden. And, sometimes I think when you look at the propaganda for the war, you think, well, why are they growing turnips and tomatoes and et cetera, et cetera? You can't ship those to the Allies. And it was not the intent to ship vegetables to the Allies. It was the intent to grow local food so you didn't have to waste transportation sources getting food to people in Montana. You'd free up the trains to carry wheat and commodities to ports and send them overseas. So these are some of my favorite of the illustrations, the propaganda over gardening. Fred Cooley, who was the head of the Montana Extension Service, said, the whole country bent nobly to the task. Lawns, railroad rights-of-way, public commons, and vacant lots became alive with people tending gardens and potato patches. There was a volunteer-based National War Garden Commission, and they plastered these posters in railway stations, libraries, stores, factories, club rooms, and banks with all of these slogans that militarized gardening, right? Every garden a munition plant. This is part of your war effort. This man was quite a character during the war, Charles Lathrop Pack. He, again, another volunteer, became the president of the National War Garden Commission, and he used, again, this very inflammatory language that we've heard a lot about today. He called upon the patriots of America to turn vacant lots, or as he called them, slacker lands, as useless as the human loafer, to make them into community gardens. And the U.S. Bureau of Education got behind this effort. They launched a gardening effort and had the United States School Garden Army, enlisting girls and boys as gardening soldiers. Children were organized into companies that had privates, lieutenants, and a captain. The federal government awarded them bronze bars for their gardening service. And most of society really supported these efforts. In Montana, the Montana Federation of Women's Clubs, which was kind of the overarching organization during the war that organized lots of voluntary clubs, they supported this effort, but they also had an interesting cautionary word, and that was that they were afraid that patriotism could veer into child labor. They didn't want people to pull children out of school to make them into farm workers. And so they said the job of the country, and I think I have a quote here. Basically, they said the role of the state was to keep the schools open and to enforce compulsory education. So gardening was fine, but as something to do after school or as a hobby, so to speak. So in 1918, the Council of Defense puts its imprimatur on the gardening movement. They ordered all mayors of Montana towns and cities to encourage their residents to plant war gardens. In Plentywood, the mayor called upon his townspeople and said, "Spend less for gasoline, stop joyriding, plant war gardens." And in a nod, perhaps, to the strong contingent of socialists and communists in the northeast corner of the state, he said, "Call them Liberty Gardens if you want, rather than calling them war gardens." The superintendent at the university in Missoula caught the war gardening fever, and he planted the grounds in potatoes in 1917 and harvested quite a crop in the fall. Let's see, okay, you've seen this poster already. The war gave new life to the what was called at the time the U.S. Cooperative Extension Service. It had only been established in 1914, and it had very little funding and very few staff. In all of Montana, there were only 2 female home demonstration agents, and they were expected to cover the entire state. So the war gives a shot in the arm to the Extension Service, and beginning in May, just a month after the U.S. enters the fray, a dozen or more new county agents were hired in order to promote the second part of Hoover's initiative, and that was food preservation. So these home demonstration agents in the summer of 1917 spread, as the director said, the gospel of canning across Montana. They distributed 9,000 instructional bulletins in what Fred Cooley called an orgy of food preservation meetings and demonstrations. And Bess Rowe, who was the leader of the state home demonstration agents, explained that their task was to teach housewives how to comply with the requests of the Food Administration and at the same time maintain the health of their families through proper feeding. So to make its work more efficient, the Extension Service helped to organize women's patriotic councils, and they were made up of representatives from already existing women's clubs. The Extension Service also created what they called flying squadrons, and these were pairs of male and female extension agents who would travel throughout the state, organizing at one point 387 farmers' defense meetings in June and July of 1917. So the female agents would give a demonstration on canning or on drying food, while the men talked about increasing crop production. So canning and drying become really a national crusade, and this is a great illustration. This is a Montana girl from Missoula who had never canned before and learns how to can during the war and wins a prize as a prize canner. In addition to teaching women how to can and preserve food in the privacy of their own homes and farms, they also set up collective community canning stations in different Montana cities. So the Patriotic Council in Missoula had a canning center in a downtown store building where volunteers from the university gave demonstrations on canning, and they actually had a day nursery, so women could bring their children and they would be cared for while their mothers were learning how to do canning or engage in other Red Cross work. At the same time, they didn't ignore young boys. They, in manual training classes, because the schools got on board with this as well, they taught young boys how to make homemade food dryers so that you would engage the whole family in this. And here, of course, we just enjoyed a pretty delicious Liberty salad for lunch. It was not called sauerkraut salad. Because, of course, sauerkraut becomes a hot political issue during World War I. During the 1918 canning season, women in Great Falls put up 300 pounds of what had become by that time somewhat controversial sauerkraut. Many Americans were shunning it because its name was German. And so there is indeed a sort of organized campaign to rename it Liberty Cabbage and encourage people to eat it because it was very rich in vitamins and it was good for people. And in fact, Alfred Atkinson the Food Administration issues a formal notice encouraging people to, quote, not let overzealous and ill-advised patriotism curtail their consumption of sauerkraut. And Alfred Atkinson chimes in from Bozeman and says, this kind of resonates with something someone said this morning, that sauerkraut was actually probably of Dutch origin, not of German origin. So it was okay to eat. Okay. So the third aspect of the food campaign, conservation, is the most controversial. It becomes highly politicized. During World War I, and I think Maggie mentioned this earlier, America did not impose formal food rationing as they did in World War II. And in fact, they do in World War II because of all the problems with voluntary compliance with food rules in World War I. So the famous meatless and wheatless first days and then meals and then days were all voluntary. But there was enormous propaganda and enormous peer pressure to follow these Food Administration rules. So one example of how this operated was at my campus at Montana State College. The college issued a booklet urging women to organize into great armies of non-combatants by focusing on home economics in order to learn the best methods of contributing to the world's food and clothing supply. The Home Economics Department offered courses on conservation as applied to clothing, so how did you remake clothing, and peanut butter in war dishes. And the president of the student body in 1918, the class president, was a woman, a home economics major who wrote her thesis on war bread, how to make war bread. The dean of women at MSC, Una Herrick, helped to organize female students to support war through a university food program. She encouraged female students to sign a sugar pledge that read, recognizing the present shortage of sugar available to the Allies in the war, we, the women of Montana State College, are glad to join the Food Administration in efforts to reduce sugar consumption in the United States. And to this end, pledge ourselves not to use more than 1 tablespoon of sugar a day and not to eat more than 6 pieces of candy a week. And they even had dimensions on how big the candy should be, which was like the size of a piece of fudge, because fudge making parties were sort of a college dormitory activity during this period of time. So that was their measure. And this, I want to go back to this slide. This is one of my favorite illustrations from the war. I think if you can see it, you know, you have this woman in the kind of height of fashionable late teens dress, and she's sucking up a huge ice cream soda or milkshake or something, and at the bottom of the glass are all the ships in the Atlantic being sucked up with her because they're full of sugar that she's diverting from this conflagration over in Europe. So, some people made fun of the young women for their sugar pledge, but they had a very interesting response. They said to the young men who were mocking their efforts, if they cut back on tobacco, beer, and liquor, it would save a lot of sugar, barley, and corn for the men at the front. So they got theirs there. So here's that wonderful quilt. It was thrilling to actually see it on display. If you weren't on the tour, this quilt is here at the Historical Society and is in the exhibit right now. And voluntary organizations really carried the banner of conservation throughout the country. The Montana Federation of Women's Clubs and the Red Cross were the two umbrella organizations organizing women's work. And in club meetings across the country, they, reorganized to highlight what women could do to support the war effort. And they devoted a lot of sections of the educational sections of their meetings to wartime food issues. So they listened to programs on canning, on war gardens, on the transportation of foodstuff, and they stopped, this was a kind of pledge that clubs made, they stopped serving the fourth meal, and the fourth meal referred to refreshments. So I have spent many a day upstairs reading women's clubs minutes for many projects over the years, and they all end with, and delicious refreshments were served. They never tell you exactly what those delicious refreshments were. They often tell you who prepared them, but that was a huge part of women's club meetings, was this kind of competitive cooking and presentation of delicious refreshments. So they pledged to stop doing that. And at the meeting of the State Federation in 1919, after the war was over, women took the occasion to look back on their wartime efforts through a play. The two MSC faculty members wrote a two-act play called The Hooverettes. And in the first act, which was set in 1908, lavishly dressed women played cards in the lounge of an overfurnished, fussy clubhouse and nibbled on delicious refreshments. In the second act, set in 1918, the same club room had been transformed into a food laboratory, and the same characters participated in a Red Cross meeting discussing food conservation, and they were all costumed in Hoover aprons. So Hoover aprons were just one of the many voluntary insignia that became part of marketing food conservation. So housewives, again, because this was all supposed to be voluntary, they signed pledge cards and then displayed them in their windows that they were abiding by the food rules. They sewed official Food Administration conservation uniforms like we see in this photo. They had a cap, a gown, and then these little insignia, which I don't have a close-up of, for the Food Administration. And this outfit quickly earned the nickname the Hoover apron. The Food Administration actually sold patterns for this apron, but that soon McCall's and Butterick's, two of the big pattern-making companies, took over the selling of the pattern. And this speaks to, Hoover's almost kind of iconic position during the war. And, Zoe-Ann talked about Hooverizing, and the Society has a pamphlet on some examples of that from material here in the collection. So Hoover's name had become synonymous with food conservation, and the press labeled these apron-clad women Hoover's Army, and to Hooverize meant to conserve food. So the Food Administration was very savvy, as were the other propaganda arms of the U.S. government, in getting its message across. They even used motion pictures. In 1917, there was a feature film, Little Miss Hoover, in which an actress wearing a Hoover apron demonstrated food conservation in a modern kitchen. Okay, So, some of the most lasting remnants of the Food Administration are these posters I've been showing you and that are reproduced in the exhibit here. And they blanketed the country, as Maggie talked about. Other aphorisms on there were lick your plate and lick the Kaiser. Eat what you can and can what you can't. And one of the big pushes was to use substitutes as a conservation measure. So cooks were urged to replace wheat flour with barley, rye, corn, and potato. So these very undelicious breads that Zoe mentioned earlier this morning. And in one of the most unusual efforts at substitution, the Food Administration urged people to adopt eating whale meat. Canned in this can. Canada actually had quite a whaling fleet, and they started to can whale meat and ship it. It was, I have to say, this never caught on. Even though the Food Administration published recipes on how to cook a whale roast, I mean, all kinds of things. But it was just one of the more unusual efforts that took place. So even without the challenges rightly posed of how do you get whale meat in Montana, substitutions required new recipes. You know, not all these flours worked in the same way, and they often bore erratic and often inedible results, but they made women feel that they were doing their part. And the pervasive propaganda of the war was designed to make every person feel that they had an obligation to support the war, and that what they did was in fact crucial to the success of the war. So the government, home economics departments, national women's magazines published cookbooks, pamphlets, bulletins with wartime recipes. And here in Montana, as we now know, thanks to Zoe-Ann and the people working on cookbooks, we had 3 homegrown Montana cookbooks. And I'm just going to talk about this one that was mentioned earlier. So this came from Hot Springs, Montana, not much of a community even then, even less so now. And they stated in their preface that the purpose of this book was not for the recipes and money derived from the sale of the book only, but that the society wished it to serve as a memento of those stirring, history-making times when we showed the world and each other that we could be true red-blooded Americans in every sense of the word. We can help win this war by eating, they wrote. But of course, one had to eat according to conservation principles. And their book included all kinds of recipes using leftover meat, beans, and potatoes, including dishes like Woodrow Wilson's Okie hash, General Pershing salad, Hoover corn and Graham gems, and General Joffrey's pudding. Many of the recipes called for using Ravalli oats, which was a wheat substitute produced by a local mill in Missoula. And indeed, one of the challenges for cooks was to figure out how to make bread, rolls, pie crust, cakes, and other baked goods with greatly reduced proportions of wheat flour. So in the it was called War-Winning Recipes produced by the Young Ladies' Sodality of Missoula's St. Xavier Church. One recipe for conservation oatmeal cookies was wheatless, eggless, and sugarless, but it called for 3 cups of corn syrup. So there was nothing that was necessarily healthy about wartime substitutions or foods. So these Hoover aprons, colorful posters, experimental recipes, what Charles Pack would say, 1 billion jars of canned produce, they were all what we might say that was the constructive side of the war. But there was a darker side, as people have alluded to as well, and that also touched the food conservation movement. So not all merchants abided by the food rules, and volunteerism could easily veer into oppression when neighbors turned to spying on each other and to tattling for what they perceived as violations of the administration's food rules. And Hoover's commitment to voluntarism also meant that he rejected rationing, but he also rejected regulation to curb inflation and price gouging and fraud. You know, he thought everything would work out, but it didn't. The Food Administration records are full of complaints about people, cafes, and bakeries that exploited wartime conditions. So, in one of my favorite letters, a traveler wrote to Herbert Hoover about a cafe in Lewistown, complaining, "Yesterday I was charged 25 cents for a cup of very weak coffee and 3 small donuts, the whole being the largest part of said donuts." But what really irritated him was that locals were being charged only 15 cents for that same bad coffee and small donuts. Mrs. George Parker sent Atkinson a loaf of raisin bread that she had bought at the Bonton Bakery in Bozeman, asking that he analyze it, for she said it was impossible to eat. She speculated it must contain either sand or ground glass or something foreign to bread. So he replied that he had, in fact, received several similar complaints, and upon investigation, discovered that the bakery had been undergoing some construction over the last 2 weeks, and that, indeed, plaster had gotten into the flour. Not an approved substitute. So that was clearly a mistake. But in other cases, businesses were quite deliberate in flaunting the food rules. In the Silver County Candy Company, used sugar that it claimed it had purchased the sugar for canning, but in fact it used it for making syrups and flavorings for their ice cream. Charges of food hoarding or failing to use substitutes led to some really egregious, what we would now call civil rights violations. And there was, because of Hoover's reluctance to have any kind of regulation or process, it was sort of up to locals, up to Atkinson, up to food administrators to figure out how to punish people who were violating these voluntary rules. And so often what they did was they would bring people to a hearing in Bozeman, and I haven't actually found any records of this, I've just found records of the results. And if a person was found to have deliberately tried to get around these food rules, they sometimes were required to return what was considered their excess sugar or flour, or they were permitted to make a donation to the Red Cross that in effect was a fine for their bad behavior. But it was all very murky. There was no real due process to the whole system. So county food administrators really formed the first line of enforcement, and some were very fervent overseers. In Prairie County, Administrator de LeSueur instructed a boarding house keeper that she could not place a sugar bowl on the table or pass a sugar bowl to her boarders. If a boarder wanted sugar in his or her coffee or tea, she could put 1 teaspoon in each cup, but only in the kitchen before it was served. I mean, this is micromanagement to the nth degree. But the most zealous, the most rabid of the food administrators was in Livingston. His name was Jerome Locke. He was an opponent of seditionists, of socialists, of wobblies, of anyone that he judged to be pro-German. And in the spring of 1918, a woman named Mrs. Carlson came to his attention. He alleged that she was known to be violently disloyal, to have indulged in seditious utterances, and he claimed that she had perjured herself in attempting to get a draft exemption for one of her sons. But he had not been in a position to do anything about those charges. Now that he was food administrator, he was surveilling her. He wrote in a letter that he spent days in his car watching her, hoping to prove that she was a food hoarder. He wanted to make her an example, arguing that if we can get one conviction, our troubles will be lessened. And indeed, he told Atkinson that if he could not get a conviction of food hoarding in Park county, he would ask to be replaced as food administrator so he could take on the job as leader of the vigilante committee. So it was not just the food administrators who were zealous. The food administration letters are packed, or the food administration files, I should say, are packed with letters from people who used food as an excuse for reviving long-standing grievances against their neighbors, for casting aspersions upon neighbors of German background, as well as for expressing well-meaning concerns and fears. And one of the most complicated but emblematic letters came from a woman in Wolf Point. She, in September of 1918, Mrs. E. Purdy wrote to Atkinson to complain that a neighbor, Ed Boulder, was letting his cattle destroy the corn of a young homesteader who was serving in the war. The young man's mother had planted the field for her son, but she was working in town, and despite chasing the cattle off many times, she could not protect her son's crop. So in her absence, Mrs. Purdy said that Boulder, she described him as a low, degraded German, let his cattle break the homesteader's fence and eat and trample his crops. She also accused him of breaking into the boy's shack to steal a pair of pliers and accused his wife of stealing eggs from the hen house. Mrs. Purdy noted that the cattle in question had been eating other neighbors' alfalfa and that Holder's hogs had been bothering her for 2 years. Moreover, she described Holder as prosperous, as he owned his own farm, which, she wrote, had all kinds of grain and cattle and horses, but he had purchased only $50 in thrift stamps, while others with much less had signed up for $100. Purdy said she hoped Holder would be drafted and put to war where he belonged. So it's hard to know which of these many grievances that Mrs. Purdy enumerated bothered her most. I mean, in that one letter are examples of almost everything we've heard today. The Food Administration, in fact, received scores of complaints from farmers that cattle were damaging their crops. And this was an old grievance based on open range laws that required farmers to fence crops but did not require fences to enclose animals. And that grievance was given new life during the war because farmers wanted to prosecute or wanted the Food Administration to prosecute livestock owners on the grounds that they were threatening wartime food production. So the fact that Holder was prospering during a time when many homesteaders were struggling, that he was allegedly thieving from a soldier, that he was cheap and unpatriotic and German, all rolled into quite an indictment. But the accusation that Purdy saved for her final volley was that Holder was imposing on this young homesteader's mother, that he was imposing on a homesteader's mother, a soldier who was off at war, whose mother had been deprived not only of her son, but that was now in a position where she could not even protect his crop. So women, despite their commitment and their best effort to remain patriotic, grew increasingly frustrated with the economics of trying to support the war and take care of their own families in the face of what they increasingly came to see as ill-conceived policies. George Bolster, the food administrator of Sheridan County, sounded a little bit desperate when he wrote to Atkinson and said that he was besieged by 300 old women who could not get the sugar they needed for canning because of the convoluted way in which sugar certificates were distributed. A Mrs. Pennington in Cutbank testified to the difficulties of abiding by the food rules. She documented her use or her attempted use of substitutes, but noted that as soon as the government said eat fish, the price of fish skyrocketed because there was no regulation. Butter substitutes cost as much as butter. She was eager to do what she could for the war, but she said the miserable profiteering bothered her, and she hoped that all crooked things would be straightened out once and for all. As Rich said, many women proclaimed that they would not support food conservation until prohibition had been put into effect, since, as one farm wife said, as long as the breweries are allowed to buy up the grain and use it for poison, what little we save won't amount to much. Other women were angered by the government's continual prodding of housewives to save small portions, while it, and here's a quote, deals with gluttonous and traitorous speculators in a soft and piddling manner. Why should they be overworked, planting, growing, harvesting, canning, conserving, while Mr. Exploiter exists uncontrolled and reaps that which we have sown? And it raised the hackles of Eva Little of Plains to read in the newspaper advice from an English lord on what Americans should eat and how they should economize. She continued, how can we call our allies democratic when they have kings, queens, lords, dukes, etc. Kings, queens, lords, dukes, etc. She said, have we not also got to be careful, or we will have a greater autocracy in this country? Are we not giving our president even more power than the Kaiser? So indeed, women had, Montana women, while willing to make sacrifices for the war, were not willing to make those sacrifices unconditionally. In 1917, the Montana Federation of Women's Clubs, which, as I said, had lent its considerable organizing skill to the war effort, outlined what women expected in return for their cooperation. The Federation argued that if the mothers of the country freely gave their sons, those boys should be housed in morally clean camps, that if there really was a serious food shortage, then national prohibition should be enacted as a war measure to save grain, and that if the future of the nation and of the world peace depended upon the next generation, boys and girls must be kept in school. So producing, cooking, and serving food had always been traditional women's work. During the war, those domestic tasks took on an additional political significance. In order to gain women's cooperation, Herbert Hoover and others told them that what had once been considered necessary but insignificant work, housework, now was of global importance. And so it's not surprising that women bombarded with new messages about the political importance of their daily chores could expand that thinking into other political and social issues. So I think, as the comments that I've related illustrate, women used their domestic chores, their domestic tasks, as a springboard to critique the economics of food distribution, the priorities of food conservation, and the very nature of American democracy. As Una Herrick said, women went into the war in a hobble skirt, but they came out less hampered in mind and body. Thank you.